I am Simon, 35 years old. On the exact day of our 7th wedding anniversary, I walked into my wife's corporate headquarters to surprise her, only to find her accepting a marriage proposal from her billionaire CEO. I stood there in the lobby, holding a bouquet of her favorite lies, watching the woman I vowed to spend my life with kiss another man, while 200 of her employees cheered them on. It was a perfectly staged spectacle. Her CEO, Harrison, even had the nerve to look right at me over her shoulder and smile. But there was one massive detail my wife and her arrogant new fiancé completely forgot to consider. They thought I was just a stay-at-home husband, a quiet tech nerd they could easily discard. They had absolutely no idea that I secretly owned 83% of that very company through a family trust. And with one phone call, I was about to vaporize their entire empire. Now they are the ones begging on my porch. Before I tell you exactly how I tore their perfect lives apart piece by piece, please hit that like button if you believe in justice, and do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's go back to the morning everything shattered. The morning of our 7th anniversary began with the deceptive calm that often precedes a disaster. The sun broke through the tall oak trees lining our driveway in upscale Connecticut, casting long, peaceful shadows across the hardwood floors of our kitchen. I was awake early, grinding fresh espresso beans. Barnaby, our aging golden retriever, rested his heavy head on my bare feet, letting out a soft sigh. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a carefully constructed illusion I had bought and paid for. Serafina emerged from the master suite exactly at 7. She was moving with that frantic, high-voltage energy she always adopted before a major corporate presentation. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a silk blouse, and a pair of heels that cost more than my first car. She did not look at me. She went straight to the marble island, picked up her travel mug, and waited for me to fill it. I handed her the coffee. I looked at her face, searching for a glimmer of recognition for what today was. I expected a smile. I expected a quiet moment between the chaos. Instead, she checked her expensive smartwatch, the one I had gifted her for her last promotion to Chief Operating Officer. She told me she had a massive quarterly review meeting and that the board of directors was expecting a flawless presentation on the new hospital integration software. She said she would be home late, perhaps very late, and told me not to wait up. She leaned in and pressed her lips against my cheek. It was a cold, practiced motion. Felt like being kissed by a marble statue. Then she turned on her heel, grabbed her designer briefcase, and walked out the door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, echoing in the quiet house. I stood there for a long time, listening to the roar of her engine as she backed out of the driveway. I told myself it was just work. I told myself that scaling a tech company required immense sacrifice. That was the lie I fed myself every single day, to tolerate the growing canyon between us. I had my own plans for the day. 7 years is a significant milestone, and I was determined to bridge the gap her ambition had created. I wanted to remind her of the couple we used to be, before the boardroom consumed her. By mid-morning, I drove downtown to an exclusive boutique travel agency. I sat across a mahogany desk from a travel agent and paid cash for 2 first-class tickets to the Maldives. I mapped out the entire surprise in my head. I would drive to Harlow Reed Technologies, bypass the security desk because I technically owned the building, and walk right into her office. I would present the flowers, hand her the thick envelope containing the flight itineraries, and tell her we were leaving on Friday. No laptops, no corporate emergencies, just the 2 of us finding each other again. I arrived at the Harlow Reed headquarters right at noon. The building was a towering monument of glass and steel, reflecting the bright afternoon sun. It was an intimidating structure. I had not set foot inside this lobby for over 18 months. I preferred the solitude of my home office, maintaining the complex back-end architecture of the software. While Serafina thrived under the bright lights of public leadership, I pushed through the revolving doors, holding the massive bouquet of lilies. The lobby smelled of polished concrete and expensive air purifier scents. Behind the curved reception desk sat a young woman I had never seen before. Her name tag read Clara. She wore a headset and was rapidly typing on her sleek computer terminal. When Clara looked up and saw the flowers, her eyes widened in absolute delight. She took off her headset and gave me a bright, welcoming smile. She did not ask for my identification. She did not ask if I had an appointment. She looked at the lilies and asked me if I was here for the big celebration. I smiled warmly, adjusting the weight of the bouquet in my arms. I assumed Serafina had finally closed the massive regional hospital contract she had been obsessing over for the past 3 quarters. I told Clara that I suppose I was, and I asked if the executive team was in the main conference room. Clara pointed a manicured finger toward the double glass doors leading to the central atrium. She told me the entire company was gathering right now, that I had perfect timing, and that I should hurry before the speeches started. I thanked her and walked toward the doors. I pushed them open and stepped into the atrium. The sound hit me like a physical wall. I heard the roaring, thunderous applause before I could fully comprehend the scene. The atrium was a massive open space with a soaring glass skylight. There were easily 200 employees gathered around a raised white platform in the center of the room. A professional string quartet was playing a lively, triumphant piece in the corner. Waiters in black vests were weaving through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal fluts of champagne. It looked like a gala. It looked like a coronation. I stayed near the back of the room, standing behind a massive potted fern. I did not want to ruin her moment of professional glory. I scanned the crowd and found her. Serafina was standing on the platform directly under the natural light pouring in from the skylight. She looked absolutely radiant. She was glowing with a kind of euphoric joy I had not seen on her face in years. And standing right next to her, holding a microphone, was Harrison. Harrison was the chief executive officer. He was a self-proclaimed visionary, a billionaire who wore custom Italian suits, drove a pristine Rolls-Royce, and regularly gave magazine interviews about his relentless drive for perfection. He was handsome, charismatic, and ruthlessly ambitious. Harrison spoke into the microphone. His voice echoed through the high-end speaker system. He started talking about the future. He talked about finding the perfect partner. He talked about how true success required a co-pilot who shared your exact vision for the world. I stood there holding the lies, smiling like an absolute fool. I genuinely believed he was announcing her promotion to president of the company. I felt a surge of pride for my wife. Then Harrison handed the microphone to an assistant. He turned to Serafina. He took both of her hands in his, and then he dropped to one knee. The entire atrium went completely, suffocatingly silent. For a fraction of a second, time simply stopped. My brain violently rejected the visual data my eyes were sending it. I watched Harrison reach into his tailored jacket pocket. I watched him pull out a black velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing a diamond so large it caught the sunlight and cast fractured rainbows across the platform. Serafina covered her mouth with both hands. Tears of pure, unadulterated happiness streamed down her face. She nodded her head rapidly. A frantic gesture of absolute acceptance. Harrison stood up. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her left ring finger. Then he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulled her body flush against his, and kissed her. The crowd erupted. The cheering was deafening. People were whistling. The string quartet swelled their music to a crescendo. 200 people were celebrating the destruction of my marriage. It was not a polite corporate kiss. It was a deeply intimate, practiced kiss. It was the kiss of a man who owned her body and soul. It was the kiss of a man who had been sleeping in the bed I paid for. A woman standing just a few feet to my left clapped her hands together, tears in her eyes. She leaned over to her coworker and whispered that they were the most perfect couple she had ever seen. I could not breathe. I could not move. The lies in my arms suddenly felt like a bundle of lead. At that exact moment, Harrison pulled away from the kiss. He kept his arm tightly around Serafina's waist. He looked out over the sea of his adoring employees, basking in his own manufactured glory. And as his gaze swept the back of the room, his eyes locked directly onto mine. Harrison knew exactly who I was. We had shared polite conversation at the company holiday party 3 years ago. He knew I was her husband. His smile did not waver. It did not falter. In fact, his smirk grew wider, stretching into a look of absolute, arrogant triumph. He leaned his head down and whispered something directly into Serafina's ear. Serafina turned her head, following his line of sight. She looked past the crowd, past the waiters, and saw me standing next to the fern. She saw the man she had promised her life to, holding a massive bouquet of her favorite flowers. All the color instantly drained from her face. The euphoric glow vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, paralyzed terror. She looked at me. Then she looked down at the massive diamond ring on her finger. Then she looked back at me. She did not push Harrison away. She did not step down from the platform. She did not scream my name. She just stood there, frozen in the spotlight, letting the crowd cheer for a life she had stolen. I did not scream. I did not throw the flowers to the floor. I did not storm the stage and throw a punch. Rage, when it reaches its absolute peak, does not burn hot and loud. Freezes. It becomes perfectly, terrifyingly silent. I turned around and walked out the glass doors. I kept my posture completely straight. I walked through the lobby, past Clara, who was clapping enthusiastically, and out into the harsh sunlight. I walked to the parking garage. I unlocked my car, got into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The heavy thud of the car door sealing shut cut off the faint sound of the music from the building. The silence inside the car was deafening. I looked at the thick envelope sitting on the passenger seat. The Maldives. The grand gesture meant to save a marriage that had already been brutally murdered. I picked up my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline had crystallized my focus. I did not call my wife. My first call was to the travel agent. I gave him my booking reference. I told him to cancel the flights, cancel the overwater villa, and refund the cash directly to my private holding account. He tried to ask if there was an emergency. I hung up. My second call was to my personal wealth manager at the bank. I provided my social security number and my maximum level security clearance PIN. I ordered an immediate, absolute freeze on every single joint account connected to Serafina's name. Checking, savings, investment portfolios, credit lines, everything. I instructed the manager to block all outgoing transfers and lock her debit cards instantly. My third call was to Montgomery. Montgomery was my family's trust lawyer. He had managed the Carter estate since I was a teenager. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who viewed human emotion as a severe liability in business. He answered on the second ring. I did not say hello. I told him what I had just witnessed. I described the platform, the ring, the kiss, and the cheering crowd. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. Montgomery did not offer pity. He offered strategy. I told Montgomery I was officially activating the primary dissolution clause. I wanted to withdraw my 83% share from the Harlow Reed holding structure immediately. The shares were currently valued at $558 million. Montgomery's breath hitched. He warned me that pulling that much equity without a standard 30-day notice would trigger an immediate, catastrophic liquidity crisis for Harlow Reed. It would freeze their operational credit lines. It would completely halt their pending IPO. It would shatter investor confidence and destroy Harrison's empire in a matter of hours. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I told Montgomery that destroying Harrison's empire was exactly the point. I told him to execute the withdrawal immediately. I started the engine and drove home. I walked inside the quiet house. I tossed the bouquet of dead lies onto the kitchen counter, next to the espresso machine. I walked into the living room and sat down in my leather armchair. The house felt like a museum. 30 minutes later, my phone screen lit up. The asset freeze must have hit her phone. The screen showed 152 missed calls from Serafina. And then, the heavy brass doorbell began to ring. The doorbell kept ringing. It was not a polite knock. It was a desperate, chaotic hammering against the heavy oak wood. I sat completely still in the shadows of my living room, listening to the frantic sound, letting the reality of the last 7 years wash over me in agonizing detail. The world looked at Serafina and saw a brilliant, self-made executive. They looked at me and saw a quiet, introverted guy who puttered around a home office, benefiting from his beautiful wife's insane corporate salary. They thought I was a leech. Her colleagues thought I was a trophy husband at best, a burden at worst. Serafina's family certainly believed I was a parasite, but none of them knew the actual origin story of Harlow Reed Technologies. None of them knew the truth about who really owned the ground they walked on. 7 years ago, we were not living in an upscale Connecticut suburb. We were living in a cramped second-floor apartment that constantly smelled of cheap takeout food and damp carpet. I was a software architect, spending 18 hours a day huddled in front of glowing monitors, coding the complex back-end architecture of a revolutionary medical data platform. Serafina was a junior marketing executive at a failing firm. She had a silver tongue, an aggressive charm, and a desperate, burning hunger for success. We were a team. We were supposed to build a life together. I built the product, and she went out and sold the vision. But vision does not pay server hosting fees. Vision does not hire development teams. We needed capital. We had maxed out every credit card we owned. The traditional banks laughed us out of their offices. That was when I made the most significant and, ultimately, the most devastating sacrifice of my life. My father had passed away suddenly a few years prior. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hollow condolences. He left behind a substantial inheritance locked securely in a family trust designed to protect my future. It contained my untouched college fund, several lucrative stock portfolios, and real estate holdings. I went to Montgomery, the custodian of the trust, and begged him to release the funds early to seed our startup. Montgomery strongly advised against it. He sat across his massive desk, steepled his fingers, and warned me about the extreme risks of mixing a young marriage with volatile venture capital. He told me that money changes people in ways love cannot prevent. But I was young, and I loved her. I trusted her implicitly. I overrode his objections and poured every single dime of my inheritance into Harlow Reed, because I provided 100% of the capital and wrote every line of the original code. The family trust legally retained 83% ownership of the corporation. The paperwork was ironclad. But as the company prepared for its public launch, Serafina sat me down on the floor of our cramped department. She held my hands, looked deep into my eyes, and begged me to stay behind the scenes. She argued that the tech investment world was brutal and misogynistic. She said investors wanted to see a dynamic, aggressive, highly visible CEO, not a quiet coder. She asked me to let her be the face of the company. She promised me that when we finally made it big, when the struggle was over, we would share the kingdom equally. I agreed. I wanted her to shine. I stepped back into the shadows, handed her the crown, and let her take absolutely all the public credit. As the company grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, Serafina fundamentally changed. The woman who used to share a cold slice of pizza with me at 2 a.m. vanished completely. She was replaced by a corporate executive who wore 1,000 shoes, complained bitterly about the lack of valet parking at high-end restaurants, and spent her weekends at exclusive corporate retreats I was never invited to attend. And then there was the nightmare of her family. Her mother Beatrice and her younger brother Preston. Once the money started flowing, my money, generated by my product, Beatrice and Preston attached themselves to us like leeches. Every Thanksgiving dinner transformed into a psychological war zone. Beatrice would sit at the head of my dining table, drinking expensive wine that I had purchased, and loudly ask when I was going to get off the couch and get a real job. She would compare me unfavorably to the husbands of her wealthy country club friends, surgeons, hedge fund managers, men who put on suits and drove to high-rise offices every morning. Preston was infinitely worse. Preston was the golden child, a 26-year-old aspiring DJ who absolutely refused to work a legitimate job. He constantly asked Serafina for massive financial handouts, treating my home like his personal ATM. He drove a luxury car he could not afford and wore designer clothes paid for by the company revenue. I remember last Thanksgiving vividly. The dining room was filled with the smell of roasted turkey. Beatrice looked right at me over the table, her eyes dripping with condescension. She said it was a profound tragedy that Serafina had to carry the financial burden of our entire household. She said it must be utterly exhausting for a brilliant woman to be the sole provider for a grown man. Serafina sat right next to her mother. She took a slow sip of her Cabernet. She said absolutely nothing. She did not defend me. She did not mention the trust. She just let her mother humiliate me in my own home, in front of the food I provided. I swallowed my pride. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I kept my mouth shut because I believed in maintaining peace. I desperately convinced myself that Serafina's extreme stress regarding her promotion to COO was the reason she let them disrespect me. But the real cracks in the foundation started showing 6 months ago. Serafina began taking mysterious, prolonged weekend business trips. She claimed they were intensive strategy sessions with the board of directors regarding the upcoming IPO. She started putting a complex numerical passcode on her phone, shielding the screen whenever I walked into the room. She started coming home late, smelling faintly of high-end men's cologne, smoothly lying that she had just hugged a client after a celebratory dinner. I buried my suspicions deep in my chest. I was completely blinded by my loyalty. I actively refused to believe that the woman I built an empire for would ever stab me in the back. I thought if I just gave her more space, more support, she would find her way back to me. But sitting in the dark living room, listening to the doorbell ring incessantly, all those fragmented memories violently clicked into a coherent picture. The late nights, the unprovoked vicious arguments, the way she physically flinched and pulled away when I tried to touch her shoulder. It was all a meticulously calculated performance. She had been living a complete double life. She was playing the beautiful, stressed wife at home while aggressively planning a glamorous future with a billionaire CEO. The doorbell finally stopped ringing. The silence was heavy. Then I heard the metallic click of the front door lock. She had used her emergency key. I remained seated in the leather chair. The hallway chandelier flicked on, casting a long, sharp shadow across the hardwood floor. The air in the house suddenly felt electric, heavy with impending violence. Serafina stepped into the living room. Her appearance was a stark contrast to the radiant woman I had seen on the platform just an hour ago. She looked completely frantic. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, strands falling across her face. Her makeup was slightly smudged under her eyes. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as if she had sprinted all the way from the corporate office. I looked past her shoulder through the large front bay window and saw a brand-new Porsche Macan parked crookedly in the driveway. It gleamed maliciously in the afternoon sun. I had never seen that vehicle before. It certainly was not purchased through our joint accounts. She walked toward me, her hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. She started speaking rapidly before I even had a chance to open my mouth. She told me I had it all wrong. She said my brain was jumping to the worst possible conclusion. She claimed the elaborate proposal in the atrium was nothing more than a massive, highly coordinated PR stunt. She spoke fast, her words stumbling over each other. She claimed Harrison believed a romantic engagement angle would humanize the company leadership, creating viral buzz right before the massive IPO launch next quarter. She actually stood there in the living room of the house I bought and tried to convince me that accepting a diamond ring from another man, kissing him passionately in front of 200 people, was a standard corporate strategy. I let her finish her desperate, pathetic, insulting speech. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I simply leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, steepling my fingers together. I looked her dead in the eye. I asked her, my voice eerily calm, if the PR stunt included the exact way his mouth tasted when she kissed him. I asked her if the PR stunt involved the brand new Porsche Macan currently parked in our driveway, leaking oil onto my pristine paving stones. She flinched as if I had struck her across the face. The elaborate lie shattered instantly. She dropped her hands to her sides. The false, desperate panic faded from her features, rapidly replaced by cold, calculating, defensive anger. She realized I was not the gullible tech nerd she thought I was. She realized I was not going to be gaslight. She crossed her arms defensively over her chest. Her tone shifted from pleading to venomous. She told me to grow up. She said I had absolutely no idea what it took to operate at her elite executive level. She claimed I had completely checked out of the marriage years ago, that I was far too comfortable being a nobody, sitting at home in sweatpants while she carried the crushing weight of the entire world on her shoulders. She called me weak. She said Harrison was a real man who understood ambition. Before I could tear her delusional argument apart, my cell phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. The caller ID showed Montgomery. I held up a single index finger, silencing my wife mid-sentence, and answered the call. I put the phone to my ear. Montgomery's voice, usually a smooth, unshakable baritone, was devoid of its usual calm demeanor. He sounded genuinely alarmed. He told me his team of paralegals were currently executing the massive asset freeze and the equity withdrawal protocol, but they had hit a catastrophic roadblock. Montgomery explained that he was looking at a massive series of financial documents filed over the last 18 months. Equity transfers, massive corporate loans secured against the company's valuation, and most sickeningly, a massive second mortgage taken out on our primary real estate, the very house we were standing in. Every single document authorized the movement of millions of dollars out of the protective trust and into untraceable private offshore accounts. I felt the blood physically freeze in my veins. The room spun slightly. I asked Montgomery, my voice dangerously low, who exactly authorized those massive transfers? There was a terrible pause on the line. I could hear Montgomery shuffling papers. Then he said, "You did, Simon. Your legal signature is on every single page. The bank validated them." I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. I stared at Serafina. She was watching me, her eyes darting nervously around the room, reading the shift in my demeanor. I had never signed a single document releasing equity. I had never authorized a second mortgage on the house. I kept all the trust paperwork securely locked in a reinforced safe deposit box at a private bank downtown. I put the phone back to my mouth. I told Montgomery, articulating every single syllable clearly, that the signatures were entirely forged. I told him to lock everything down immediately, flag the accounts with federal authorities for massive wire fraud, and prepare to file an immediate, devastating lawsuit against both Serafina and the executive board of Harlow Reed. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up. I am a full foot taller than her, and for the first time in our entire 7-year relationship, I let her see the absolute unfiltered fury burning behind my eyes. I did not hide the monster she had awakened. I walked slowly toward her. The air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. She took a step back, her heel hitting the edge of the glass coffee table. I asked her exactly how much money she stole from my family's trust. I asked her how much of my dead father's money she used to finance her affair. Her jaw tightened. She tried to deny it, but her voice shook violently. She stammered. She said she just leveraged some liquid assets to keep the company afloat during a historically bad financial quarter. She said I wouldn't understand the complex financial mechanics of corporate debt structuring. I stepped closer, invading her space, until she was forced to lean back. I told her I understood the mechanics of a federal fraud charge perfectly well. I told her she had forged my legal signature. She had systematically stolen millions of dollars from the man who gave her absolutely everything, and she used my inheritance to fund her glamorous, sickening life with Harrison. The betrayal was so deep, so methodical, it was almost impossible to comprehend. She had not just broken my heart, she had meticulously tried to destroy my financial future, leaving me with massive debt. While she prepared to marry a billionaire, I raised my arm and pointed a rigid finger toward the front door. I told her to get out. She tried to argue. She planted her feet. She said this was her house too. She said her name was on the deed. She said we needed to sit down, pour a drink, and talk to a divorce lawyer like civilized, rational adults. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and openly dialed the local police precinct. I did not break eye contact with her for a millisecond. I told her that if she was not out of my house in exactly 60 seconds, I would have her arrested for criminal trespassing, and I would hand over the forged mortgage documents to the financial crimes detectives tonight. I told her she would be sleeping in a holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit before midnight. She looked deeply into my eyes and saw the absolute truth. I was entirely done. The husband she could manipulate was dead. She grabbed her designer purse, her hands shaking violently. She gave me a look of pure, concentrated hatred, a look that confirmed she had never truly loved me at all. She turned, walked out the door, and slammed it behind her. I watched through the window as she got into the Porsche Harrison bought her with my money, ground the gears, and sped away, leaving black tire marks on the driveway. I walked over to the door, locked the heavy deadbolt, and engaged the digital security system. I called Barnaby over to me. I sat heavily on the floor with my dog, burying my face in his golden fur, feeling the crushing, echoing silence of the empty house press in on me. The marriage was over. The war had officially started. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in cold, silent execution. I did not sleep a single minute. I drank 4 pots of black coffee. I completely transformed my home office into a heavily fortified legal war room. White bars were brought in. Stacks of financial records covered every available surface. At 6 a.m., Montgomery arrived. He did not come alone. He brought Valerie. Valerie was a senior forensic accountant, a woman who looked like a strict librarian but operated like a merciless financial assassin. She did not care about the emotional drama. She did not ask me how I was feeling. She only cared about the numbers, the metadata, and the digital paper trail. She opened her laptop, connected to the encrypted bank servers, and went to work. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the rapid clicking of her keyboard. By noon, Valerie found the smoking gun. It wasn't just Serafina acting alone. The forged documents, the hidden transfers, the inflated expense reports, they all had to pass through the company's complex financial department. Someone with highly clearance inside Harlow Reed had to actively approve the movement of the stolen funds and mask them from the standard auditing software. Valerie tracked the digital footprint back through a maze of dummy shell companies. It all pointed to one specific, highly restricted executive authorization code. It belonged to Desmond. Desmond was the chief financial officer of Harlow Reed. More importantly, Desmond was supposed to be my closest friend. We used to play golf together every Sunday. I was a groomsman at his wedding. I had personally recommended him for the CFO position when the company first expanded. But when Serafina gained absolute operational power, she brought Desmond into her corrupt inner circle. Valerie projected the wire transfers onto the wall monitor. Desmond had been systematically hiding the money Serafina stole from my trust. He disguised the massive fund transfers as vendor payments, offshore consulting fees, and inflated equipment purchases. And where did that money go? It went to buy a $200,000 limited edition Patek Philippe watch for Harrison's birthday. It went to pay for a staggering 2-year lease on a luxury penthouse condo in the city, where I assume she and Harrison spent their strategy weekends sweating the sheets. And incredibly, disgustingly, a significant chunk of it went directly into the private checking account of Preston, my worthless brother-in-law, disguised as a fake salary for a marketing consultant role that didn't exist. Desmond had actively helped my wife funnel my dead father's money to her billionaire lover and her parasitic family. Right as Valerie was highlighting the routing numbers in red, my cell phone rang on the desk. The caller ID showed Desmond's name. He was panicking. The automated security alerts from the massive asset freeze Montgomery initiated must have finally hit his desk. He realized the accounts were locked. He realized someone was looking at the books. I stared at his name flashing repeatedly on the screen. The old me, the naive, trusting husband, would have answered the phone and demanded a tearful explanation. The new me simply stared at the screen, letting it ring. I hit the ignore button. Let him sweat. Let him pace his office and realize the walls of his prison cell were rapidly closing in. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a FaceTime call. It was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. I pressed accept and put the phone on speaker, laying it flat on the desk so Montgomery and Valerie could hear every word. Beatrice did not bother saying hello. She immediately started screaming at me through the phone speaker. Her voice was shrill and filled with absolute entitlement. She demanded to know why Serafina's platinum credit cards were declining at the high-end boutique down the street. She called me a controlling psychotic monster. She said I was financially abusing her brilliant daughter simply because I was insecure about my own pathetic lack of a career. I let her vent. I sat back in my chair, crossed my arms, and listened to the woman who had eaten my food, drank my wine, and lived off my money for 7 years curse my name with venomous hatred. Then Preston jumped into the frame. He must have been standing right next to her at the boutique counter. He laughed, a cruel, mocking, arrogant sound. He pointed a finger at the camera and told me I was pathetic. And then, riding high on his own arrogance, he made the ultimate fatal mistake. He proudly stated that he was glad Serafina was finally moving on with Harrison. He bragged loudly that the entire family had gone out to a celebratory dinner with Harrison over 6 months ago at a private Michelin star restaurant. He said Harrison was a real man, a real provider, and that the family had been waiting impatiently for the day Serafina would finally drop a dead-weight losser like me. I smiled, a cold, genuine, terrifying smile. They knew. The whole family knew about the affair for over half a year. They actively encouraged it because Harrison was a billionaire. They sat at my table, ate my turkey at Thanksgiving, and smiled in my face while actively plotting to replace me with a richer man. I leaned closer to the phone microphone. I didn't yell. I kept my voice incredibly calm, devoid of any emotion. I told Beatrice and Preston that their free ride was officially over. I told them the credit cards were permanently shut off. I told them the monthly allowance Serafina had been illegally sending them from my accounts was gone forever. Before they could even process the words, I ended the call. I looked up at Montgomery. He was sorting through a thick stack of corporate board meeting protocols. I asked him when the emergency board of directors meeting was officially scheduled. Montgomery checked his gold pocket watch. He told me it was set for exactly 9 a.m. the following morning. Harrison had called it urgently, likely to reassure the panicked investors about the frozen credit lines and to legally push my trust out of the company entirely. Harrison arrogantly thought he held all the cards. He thought he was dealing with a defeated, heartbroken cuckold. I stood up and smoothed the front of my shirt. I looked at the whiteboard covered in evidence of their crimes. I told Montgomery to make sure my high-definition webcam was fully operational. Tomorrow morning, I was going to officially introduce myself to the board of directors, and I was going to burn Harrison's stolen kingdom straight to the ground. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a bitter, biting cold that seemed to seep straight through the walls of my Connecticut home. Outside my window, a heavy storm was rolling in. The sky painted in bruised shades of purple and charcoal gray. The wind violently rattled the thick glass of my home office windows, but inside, the atmosphere was completely still. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that always precedes a massive explosion. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, staring at the blank high-definition monitor mounted on the far wall. The digital clock in the bottom right corner of the screen seemed to tick forward in agonizing slow motion. Montgomery, my fiercely loyal and ruthless family lawyer, was seated to my right. He was meticulously arranging thick, heavy folders of financial records, legal statutes, and sworn affidavit. He moved with the precise, calculated efficiency of a surgeon preparing to amputate a diseased limb. Valerie, the senior forensic accountant who had stayed awake for 36 straight hours tracing the stolen funds, sat to my left. She was already securely logged into the encrypted banking server. Her fingers hovered steadily over her illuminated keyboard, fully prepared to deploy the devastating financial evidence like a tactical military strike. I was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a solid black tie. I had not worn a suit of this caliber since my own father's funeral many years ago. Sitting there in the quiet room, waiting for the video conference link to activate, I realized this morning felt very much like another funeral. I was preparing to permanently bury the pathetic, naive, excessively trusting version of myself. I was burying the man who had willingly sacrificed his own identity, his own college fund, and his own inheritance to build a corporate kingdom for a woman who ultimately despised him. At exactly 8:55, the encrypted video conference portal went live. The massive wall screen immediately split into multiple high-resolution grid squares, illuminating my dark office with a harsh blue light. One by one, the elite board of directors of Harlow Re Technologies logged into the emergency session. I kept my own high-definition camera completely disabled and my microphone firmly muted. On their screens, I was nothing but a silent, anonymous black square, labeled with the simple text, Carter Family Trust Equity Representative. They had absolutely no idea that the man sitting in silence behind that dark square was the exact same guy who had spent 18 hours a day coding the very software platform that paid for their luxury vacation homes. I recognized every single face populating the digital grid. There was Reginald, the elderly chairman of the board. He was sitting in his sprawling mahogany-paneled library, surrounded by antique books. He was a man of old money, who valued traditional corporate stability above all else. And this morning, he looked incredibly stressed. The deep lines around his mouth were tightly drawn. Next to him on the grid was Gideon, the lead independent director. Gideon was sharp, analytical, and highly skeptical of sudden market movements. He sat in a sterile white office, aggressively chewing on the end of a silver pen, radiating severe agitation. And then, filling the largest grid square originating from the main executive conference room downtown, were Harrison and Serafina. Harrison was lounging casually in his oversized leather executive chair at the head of the long, polished table. He was purposely not wearing a tie, portraying that carefully manufactured, highly curated image of a relaxed, untouchable tech billionaire. He wore a crisp designer shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and he looked aggressively confident. He actually looked bored, as if this massive financial crisis was nothing more than a minor annoyance cutting into his golf schedule. Serafina sat right next to him, her posture rigidly perfect. She wore a pristine white designer dress that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Her hair was pulled back into a severe professional knot. She looked slightly tired, the skin around her eyes just a fraction puffy, but she maintained an icy, impenetrable facade of absolute control. Behind them, through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom, the sprawling city skyline stretched out completely oblivious to the absolute massacre that was about to take place within those glass walls. Reginald cleared his throat loudly into his microphone, the sound carrying a heavy weight, calling the emergency meeting to order. His voice was growly and lacked any of the usual warm corporate pleasantries. Reginald stated for the official legal record that Harlow Reed Technologies was currently facing an unprecedented catastrophic liquidity crisis. He explained in stark terms that the Carter Family Trust, which legally held 83% of the voting shares, had abruptly initiated a hostile equity withdrawal. Furthermore, the trust had ordered an immediate total freeze on all operational credit lines and asset accounts. Reginald looked directly into his camera lens and said this aggressive action threatened to completely derail the upcoming massive IPO, vaporize investor confidence, and force the company into immediate federal bankruptcy proceedings before the end of the week. Harrison leaned forward, dominating the camera frame, completely unbothered. He adjusted his expensive jacket and began to speak in that smooth, practiced baritone voice he regularly used for glowing magazine interviews and keynote speeches. He told the board of directors not to panic. He actually chuckled, a patronizing, condescending sound that echoed loudly through my office speakers. He confidently stated that this aggressive maneuver by the Carter Trust was nothing more than a classic, transparent intimidation tactic used by archaic investment firms to secure a much larger financial payout right before a highly lucrative IPO. Harrison looked around the virtual room, making eye contact with the camera, and confidently declared that he had already spoken at length to his personal wealth management team in New York. He promised the board, putting his hand over his heart, that he would personally leverage his own vast private real estate assets and stock portfolios to bridge the current financial gap. He swore he would secure a massive new line of credit by the afternoon, and ultimately buy the Carter Trust out of the company entirely, removing them as a constant threat to their innovation. Harrison masterfully framed himself as the ultimate corporate savior. He spoke passionately about his unique vision, his bold leadership, and his unwavering commitment to the corporate family. He then turned his head to look at Serafina and publicly praised her. He called her the most brilliant, resilient chief operating officer in the entire tech industry. He claimed that together, as a unified leadership front, they would seamlessly guide Harlow Reed through this temporary turbulence and steer it straight into a multi-billion-dollar valuation. I sat in my quiet office, my hands resting flat on my desk, listening to this arrogant man outline his grand strategy using the exact company I built with my own hands. I listened to him casually talk about my inheritance, my father's legacy, as if it were petty cash he could simply sweep off the boardroom table. Gideon, the sharp independent director, suddenly interrupted Harrison's grand monologue. Gideon looked extremely nervous and was no longer chewing his pen. He pointed out the massive mathematical flaw in Harrison's promise. Gideon stated clearly that buying out an 83% equity stake would require several hundreds of millions of dollars in highly liquid cash, something Harrison certainly did not have readily available on hand, without totally liquidating his own wealth and triggering a massive tax liability. Gideon also astutely noted that the formal notice from the trust had explicitly cited massive financial irregularities and potential executive misconduct as the legal basis for the sudden withdrawal. Harrison waved his hand dismissively at the camera, completely brushing off the accusation. He blatantly, smoothly lied to the board of directors on a recorded corporate line. He stated that the alleged financial irregularities were simply minor clerical errors. He claimed they were insignificant accounting discrepancies regarding travel expenses that his brilliant CFO Desmond was already correcting. As they spoke, Harrison passionately insisted that the Carter Trust was weaponizing these minor clerical errors to force an illegal hostile takeover. Reginald sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if he felt a massive migraine coming on. He looked directly at the black square on his screen that represented me. Reginald formally addressed the Carter Family Trust. He asked the representative to please turn on their camera, state their full legal identity for the corporate record, and explain the exact justification for attempting to unilaterally destroy the company they were heavily invested in. Montgomery looked at me. He gave me a single, sharp nod of absolute approval. The trap was now perfectly set. The bait had been swallowed whole. Harrison had just explicitly lied to the board of directors on a recorded federal line regarding corporate finances. I reached my right hand out and placed my index finger on the computer mouse. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with cold air. I thought about the last 7 years of calculated lies. I thought about the agonizing Thanksgiving dinners where I sat silently and allowed myself to be humiliated. I thought about the passionate kiss in the atrium that shattered my reality. I thought about my father's hard-earned legacy being systematically used to buy luxury watches and penthouses for a man who slept with my wife. I clicked the button and enabled my hide camera. The anonymous black square on the video conference grid instantly vanished, replaced immediately by a crystal-clear, high-definition broadcast of my face sitting behind my heavy oak desk. I looked directly into the camera lens, ensuring my facial expression was entirely devoid of warmth, completely stripped of any lingering hesitation or mercy. The reaction across the digital grid was instantaneous and absolutely spectacular to witness. On the main executive screen, I watched the arrogant, smug smile physically slide off Harrison's face as if it had been violently wiped away by an invisible hand. He blinked rapidly, his eyes widening in pure shock. Leaning closer to his monitor, as if he was experiencing a vivid hallucination. Beside him, Serafina looked like she had just been struck by a high-voltage electrical current. Her jaw literally dropped open, abandoning all pretense of corporate poise. The color drained from her face so fast and so completely that her skin perfectly matched the pristine white of her designer dress. She gripped the heavy edge of the polished conference table so hard, her knuckles turned stark, bone white, for 10 agonizing, beautiful, incredibly long seconds. Absolutely nobody on the call spoke a single word. The silence was absolute, thick, and suffocating. Reginald was the very first person to break the stunned silence. He aggressively squinted at his screen, adjusting his thick reading glasses. Leaning forward in his leather chair, he looked profoundly confused. He said, his voice laced with irritation, that they had formally requested the legal representative of the Carter Family Trust. He demanded to know who exactly was sitting on this secure line. I leaned forward, deliberately clasping my hands together on the center of my desk. I kept my voice perfectly measured, projecting a cold, hard authority I had kept deeply hidden for nearly a decade. I formally introduced myself as Simon Carter. I stated clearly and unequivocally that I was the sole living beneficiary and absolute legal controller of the Carter Family Trust. I looked directly at Harrison's grid square on the monitor and added, raising my voice just a fraction, that I was also the original software architect of Harlow Reed Technologies, the sole provider of the initial seed capital, and, as of this very morning, the husband of the chief operating officer sitting right next to him. The collective sharp gasp from the other board members was clearly audible through my office speakers. Gideon physically recoiled in his office chair, his eyes darting back and forth across the screen. Reginald looked completely stunned, shifting his furious gaze from my calm face on the screen directly to Serafina's terrified expression. Harrison desperately tried to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. His voice cracked slightly, completely losing all of its practiced smooth bravado. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at the camera and shouted that this was a massive illegal conflict of interest. He frantically demanded that I be immediately disconnected and removed from the secure call, aggressively claiming this was nothing more than a messy, bitter domestic dispute unfairly spilling over into vital corporate governance. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic energy. I simply told Harrison to shut his mouth. I spoke the words with such absolute, freezing, terrifying authority that he actually snapped his jaw shut instantly, looking like a scolded child. I turned my absolute attention back to Reginald, the chairman. I informed the entire board of directors that this was absolutely not a domestic dispute. I stated for the official record that this was a critical emergency intervention designed to stop a massive, highly coordinated federal wire fraud conspiracy happening right under their noses. I told them without flinching that my wife and their trusted CEO had been using Harlow Reed as their personal, untraceable piggy bank to fund a lavish, illicit affair, and they had done so by systematically forging my legal signature on federal loan documents. Serafina finally found her voice. It was high-pitched, shrill, and completely hysterical. She lunged toward the center boardroom microphone and screamed that I was lying to everyone. She called me a jealous, vindictive, mentally unstable psychopath. She frantically told the board that I was intentionally trying to ruin her pristine career because I was deeply threatened by her massive success, her wealth, and her upcoming promotion to president. I did not argue with her. I did not defend myself against her pathetic insults. I simply turned my head and gave a sharp nod to Valerie. Valerie immediately pressed a single hotkey on her laptop. Instantly, she bypassed the security protocols and hijacked the primary screen sharing function of the video conference. The faces of the panicked board members shrank to a small column on the side, and the main display screen was entirely filled with high-resolution, undeniable scans of internal financial documents. Valerie's cold, clinical, utterly emotionless voice began narrating the devastating presentation. She first displayed the massive secondary mortgage taken out on my primary real estate in Connecticut. She highlighted the forged signatures at the bottom of the page in thick, bright red circles. She then displayed a side-by-side forensic comparison of my actual verified signature next to the crude, rushed forgery Serafina had executed to secure the massive loans. The visual difference was completely undeniable to anyone with eyes. Next, Valerie swiftly pulled up the highly classified internal routing numbers and banking ledgers. She showed the board exactly, step by step, how Desmond, the chief financial officer they all trusted, had explicitly authorized the transfer of millions of dollars out of the protective trust accounts. She detailed how he washed the stolen money through a complex web of dummy vendor invoices and offshore shell corporations to avoid standard quarterly audits. Valerie did not stop there. The killing blow was the itemized expenses. She showed the exact, unredacted receipts. She showed the horrified board the invoice for a $200,000 Patek Philippe luxury watch billed directly to the company ledger as a critical client retention expense. She showed the ironclad 2-year lease agreement for a luxury downtown penthouse suite falsely listed on the corporate books as a remote strategy and development hub. She even showed the massive, entirely fraudulent bi-weekly salary payments being funneled directly into the private checking account of Preston, a man who had never once set foot inside the Harlow Reed building or contributed a single hour of labor. I sat back and watched the elite board members process the devastating, undeniable reality unfolding on their screens. They were not looking at a bitter husband making wild accusations. They were looking at hard, undeniable, federally prosecutable evidence of massive corporate embezzlement, identity theft, and wire fraud committed by their top executives. Gideon forcefully unmuted his microphone. His face was a dark shade of purple with righteous rage. He looked directly at Harrison and Serafina on the screen and aggressively demanded an immediate, coherent explanation. This was the exact moment the rats violently turned on each other to survive. Harrison realized in a fraction of a second that his entire carefully constructed billionaire facade was collapsing into dust. He realized the SEC and federal authorities would be kicking down his front door before he even ate lunch. He looked at the damning evidence on the screen. Then he looked at the terrified woman sitting next to him. Harrison stood up so fast his heavy leather executive chair violently crashed to the hardwood floor behind him. He threw his hands high in the air and completely ruthlessly threw the woman he had romantically proposed to just 24 hours ago straight under the heaviest bus he could find. He shouted into the microphone that he had absolutely no idea where the money came from. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at Serafina's face and yelled that she had repeatedly told him she was independently wealthy from a previous tech buyout. He claimed she entirely managed all the internal finances with Desmond and that he, as the visionary CEO, was purposely kept completely insulated from the day-to-day accounting department. He actually looked deeply into the camera and played the desperate victim, claiming Serafina had maliciously deceived him in a calculated effort to buy his affection and secure her own promotion. Serafina stared up at him, her eyes wide with absolute, world-shattering horror. The powerful man she had willingly destroyed her marriage for, the man she had stolen millions of dollars for, was entirely abandoning her the absolute second the ship started sinking into the ocean. She reached out with shaking hands and grabbed his expensive jacket sleeve, crying, begging him to stop talking, desperately reminding him that they were in this together. Harrison ripped his arm away from her frantic grasp with genuine visible disgust. He looked at the camera, told the board his elite legal team would be in touch within the hour, and stormed aggressively out of the conference room. A few short minutes later, looking through the floor to see Ealing windows behind Serafina on the video feed, I watched Harrison's sleek black Rolls-Royce speed out of the reserved executive parking lot, fleeing the massive disaster he actively helped create. He left her sitting there, completely alone, in the massive, echoing boardroom. Reginald did not hesitate for another second. The board took an immediate, unanimous, aggressive emergency vote. They formally terminated both Serafina and Desmond for absolute undeniable cause. They voted to instantly strip them of all unvested stock options, sever all severance packages, and formally directed corporate counsel to cooperate fully and aggressively with federal authorities regarding the massive embezzlement and fraud charges. I looked at Serafina on the screen one last time. She was completely broken, staring blankly at the empty leather chair beside her, her chest heaving with silent sobs. The glittering corporate kingdom was completely gone. The billionaire prince had fled. I calmly reached forward and ended the video call, plunging the screen back into darkness. After the emergency board meeting, Simon's plan succeeded completely. Serafina and Desmond were fired for cause, stripped of their stock options and severance, and exposed as participants in a massive scheme involving forged signatures, stolen trust funds, fraudulent mortgages, offshore transfers, and corporate embezzlement. Harrison immediately abandoned Serafina when the evidence surfaced, attempted to blame her for everything, and fled the company before the board could hold him accountable. The board later forced him to resign to protect the company's future and reputation. Serafina returned to Simon's house, broken, unemployed, and abandoned. But Simon refused to let her inside. He handed her divorce papers, requiring her to waive alimony, property claims, and access to every account, warning that any attempt to fight the agreement would result in the complete forensic file being delivered to federal prosecutors. She signed and left the marriage with nothing. When Beatrice and Preston arrived, demanding that Simon restore their money and allowances, he revealed that their accounts had been funded with stolen assets, and that Preston's fake salary was now under investigation. He ordered them off his property, permanently ending their access to his life and fortune. 8 months later, Simon had reclaimed Harlow Reed Technologies and stepped into the role of executive chairman. He hired an ethical CEO, launched a company-wide audit, and rebuilt the business around accountability. Desmond lost his financial licenses through a plea agreement. Harrison lost his leadership position and professional reputation, and Serafina was reduced to working a modest retail job while living with her mother under crushing debt. Preston was forced to sell his sports car and take manual labor to repay taxes. Simon, meanwhile, finally used the anniversary trip he had originally planned for Serafina, but this time he traveled alone. In the Maldives, he found the peace he had sacrificed for years. On the final evening, he threw his wedding ring into the ocean and understood that the greatest victory was not destroying the people who betrayed him or reclaiming the company they had stolen. It was recovering his identity, his dignity, and his belief in his own worth. He learned that supporting someone does not mean surrendering every boundary, resource, and piece of yourself. By protecting his inheritance, exposing the truth, and refusing to remain a supporting character in someone else's ambition, Simon finally took control of his own life and walked away free.